Welcome. This module on debate on quota within quota is the fourth module of the fourth unit, that is Women and Reservation Contemporary Debate of the Women's Studies course. The objective of this module is to acquaint the reader with the debate on subquota, demand for subquota within the Women's Reservation Bill. In this module, I am going to first discuss about what does it mean when one demands quota within quota. In the subsequent section, I discuss the arguments given by the OBC and minority leaders while they demand reservations, sub-reservations for women belonging to these categories within the 33% reservation. In the next section, I discuss some of the theoretical issues involved, following which I discuss the stand taken by the feminists and the women's organizations in this regard. Finally, in the concluding section, I summarize the chapter. I begin by discussing what is meant by quota within a quota. In simple words, a quota within quota means sub-reservation for SCs, STs, OBCs and minority communities within the 33% quota demanded by the Women's Reservation Bill. This amounts to the demand that other marginalized communities should also have representation within the women's quota. There have been intense debates on the provisions of the bill. However, the biggest debate surrounding the issue has been the debate regarding the grant of subquotas for women belonging to OBC and minority communities. And this has been the reason, the most influential reason for the multiple derailments of the bill. The fiercest opposition has been leveled by the male political leaders of some of the political parties who have seen in the Women's Reservation Bill, and to quote, an upper caste ploy to stem the rising tide of lower caste men in politics, unquote. Let us now discuss the arguments of the OBC and minority leaders. It is argued that a blanket reservation policy would only bring in privileged upper caste and upper class women. Consequently, it is the advocates of the backward castes in particular who have raised the biggest hue and cry against the bill. The critics of the bill have demanded subquotas for OBC women. They were soon joined by Muslim and later Dalit leaders demanding subquotas for Muslim and Dalit women respectively. The lobby opposing the bill on account of demand for quota within quota consisted of politicians, maximum of whom were male, belonging to the Janata Dal, the Bahujan Samaj Party, the Samajwadi Party, one faction of the Bharatiya Janata Party led by Umma Bharati, and the Shitkari Sangathan Women's Front, the Shitkari Mahila Agadi. Mulayam Singh Yadav of the Samajwadi Party, Sharad Yadav of the Janata Dal and Lalu Prasad Yadav of the Rashtriya Janata Dal refused to let the bill be introduced in Parliament unless it provides for 20% subquota within the 33% for women of backward castes. They argued that if women from OBC category were not granted a subquota, the benefits of reservation will be appropriated by the women of the elite class, who will never promote the interests of the lower classes or castes. The opposition of the aforementioned leaders was coupled with the reluctance of the same political parties towards the issue who had earlier supported reservation for women in local bodies. Mary E. John argues that it is the silence of the supporters rather than the opposition to the bill that has gone a long way in stalling it. She writes, quote, "It is a silent subversion of the eyes and not the noisy disruption of the nays that has been responsible for the 14 years of exile endured by this bill," unquote. She refers back to the media demonizing the backward caste and Muslim politicians opposing the bill while serving to obscure the unspoken patriarchies that are at work in every political party, in the words of Menon. She further writes that, quote, "A feminist perspective on the question of reservations for women today would have to take account of subjugated or dominated patriarchies," unquote. Let us now discuss some of the theoretical issues. Menon further places the debate on another ground based on a defense of abstract citizenship against any kind of affirmative action, that is, an anti-reservation position in general. She notes that even though this position interestingly was not taken by any political party, but was voiced out by individual writers. Vandana Sonalkar says that the bringing up of the issue of reservations for non-upper caste women in parliament and state legislatures by the opponents of the 81st Amendment Bill has brought to the fore the question of caste and gender as aspects of the citizen subject. Shakuntala Narsingan also writes, quote, "Among feminist issues worldwide, perhaps few typify class, caste, gender alignments as eloquently as the curious case of India's Women's Reservation Bill, which has been the subject of uproarious arguments in Parliament for the last 5 years." Unquote. Thus, the issue of who represents whom, or more categorically, who can represent whom, became central in the debate theoretically. Let us now look at the views from feminists or women's organizations. The most common feminist stance to the question of subquota was that of asserting the commonality of women's interests and therefore no need for subquota for OBC or Muslim women. They even saw the demand for subquota as an attempt at dividing women with the objective of diluting the demand for women's reservation. In that sense, it was seen as a male chauvinist ploy of the male politicians. Narasimhan says that the demand for subquota raises 3 questions, one of which is, does gender divide on the basis of class and caste as the Yadavs claim, or does gender unite women as a group across the caste class divisions? However, there were debates regarding the stand taken by feminists. Kishwar writes, quote, "By polarizing the issue on gender lines, the pro-reservationists have actually exposed the weakness in their own ranks. They claim to speak on behalf of all India's women, yet OBC and Muslim women prefer to go along with their men's politics, no matter how chauvinist, no matter how dishonest, than with the feminist lobby. When the bill suffered a humiliating defeat in Parliament amidst very ugly scenes by OBC and Muslim MPs, none of the OBC or Muslim women leaders stood up to defend the bill or claim solidarity with the pro-women's reservation lobby." Unquote. While challenging the ability of the feminist groups to speak on the behalf of all the women of the country, Kishwar also challenged the notion of quota itself in proving a sufficient way for ensuring representation of groups in Indian society. She writes, quote, "This demand for reservations within reservations demonstrates how the very logic of reservations can be stretched endlessly, especially given a situation of high fragmentation within our society, existence of gross inequalities within every group, and the general dysfunctionality of democratic institutions so that virtually every group feels aggrieved." Unquote. She stresses that if the logic of subquota is that the oppressed groups among women should have special provisions, why just talk of the OBC women? The list of marginalized groups is indeed endless and may include physically handicapped women, women afflicted with leprosy, beggars, prostitutes, and so on. She says that the women's organizations have taken up the debate on the subquota for OBC and Muslim women only because men of these communities have put the issue on the agenda. She rejected the idea of caste and communal quotas within a women's quota, as this would amount to essentially delegitimize the idea that women as a group have common interests, rendering the very demand for a women's quota infructuous. At another place, Kishwar also rejects the demand for subquotas on grounds that within the backward castes, the few women to get benefited would include women from the upper castes. She writes, quote, "But the chances are that we will be saddled with more BV Beti brigades because OBC leaders are likely to resort to fielding their mothers or sisters or wives to ensure that the women's quota stays within their caste control, and women legislators do not pose any challenge to their power." Unquote. John makes a case for the defense of subquotas for OBC women. She argues that interlocking structures of exclusion prevent the emergence of representative women politicians. Patriarchies are diverse and unequal, and OBC women are trapped within low levels of education, absence of property rights, and powerful ideologies of domesticity. Thus, subquotas are required for their greater political presence. In response to the OBC leaders' opposition to the bill on account of demand for subquota, questions have been raised regarding their intention to really promote the cause of OBC or minority women. It has been contended that the real agenda is not to help OBC and minority women come to the forefront, but to forestall the issue of women's reservation itself. Narasimhan writes, quote, that the insistence of sub-quotas is not born of any special concern for OBC women is evidenced by the report that Mulayam and Sharad Yadav are willing to accept a deal that cuts the quota to 10 or 15% without a sub-quota for OBCs. Since women's representation in parliament is already 9%, this would be no big deal, unquote. She further questions the silence of the ruling party leaders, including the then Prime Minister's refusal to concede to the demand for sub-quotas when it could have ensured the passage of the bill. She infers that, quote, curiously then, both sides of male players are engaged in tactics that will enable them to project themselves as champions of women's progress without having to actually yield towards gender equity. Gender then is the crucial determinant, and class caste factors get used as excuses to strengthen male dominance. Class and caste are not red herrings but strong, powerful, emotional arsenal used for sexist ends. This then is the crux. Between political priorities and social equity, the former ends up winning because politics is dominated by males, a typical catch-22 situation, unquote. There were few others who accepted the need for reservations for OBC and minority women but wished to take that demand up at a later stage. Few others articulated the demand for quota for women within the broader context of demand for OBC reservations in India. Vasant and Kalpana Kanibaran write, quote, nobody who firmly believes in affirmative action would oppose reservations for OBCs. Further, when women are today asking for proportionate representation, to deny it to backward classes would be a gross self-contradiction. The struggle for reservations for OBCs in general is yet to make significant headway, unlike SC/ST reservations, which are already guaranteed by the Constitution and hence become operative within the women's quota as well. Right now, the urgency is to articulate a demand for OBC reservations in Parliament, which will then automatically become operative in the women's quota, unquote. They further say that women may have to demand for reservation within the OBC quota and find a difficult way here. They write, the test will be when, if OBC quota is granted, how easily it will include 33% reservation for women within that quota. And that really is the key question that nobody against the 81st Amendment is even thinking about. What Uma Bharati and Phulan Devi, the latter still too young in politics, will soon realize is that they too, in their defense of the rights of the OBCs, will very soon have to shift their gaze to think of how women's interests can be contained in the arguments of the OBC lobby, which is far too overwhelmingly and self-centeredly male, unquote. Thus, it was being contended by most of the feminists and women's organizations that the issue of sub-quota was only raised as a ploy to stem the tide of mounting support for the women's reservation bill and to catch it in controversy, as also to seek to divide women amongst themselves. Also, the non-acceptance of the demand may have stalled chances of any reconciliation. However, there is lack of consensus around the issue of quota within quota. The demand has been construed to be unconstitutional, as the Constitution neither grants reservations for OBCs nor on the basis of religion. Vidhu Verma has highlighted this point, that the demand for sub-quotas for OBCs and Muslims has not been within the original mandate of the Constitution. Thus, if it is to be granted in case of OBC and minority women, it will have to be accompanied by constitutional modification. She also points out that the OBC community is not in general politically and electorally marginalized. Thus, as of now, there has been no demand for reservations for OBCs in legislature. Being a diverse category, the demand for the reservations for OBC women thus needs to have sound factual details of who OBC women are. She further writes, quote, the arguments over sub-quotas prove that gender as a legitimate political category is less than religion, caste, class, and tribe, and these group identities would have to be negotiated before pressing for reservations for women, unquote. Regarding demand for SC women's quota, Kishwar points out that they were unmindful of the fact that the provision for the latter already exists in the proposed bill. Or perhaps it's a strategy to corner extra seats for SCs from the women's quota rather than yield seats for women of their communities from the existing SC quota. Although having mixed responses on the issue, most women's groups accept the principle of quotas within quotas. But while some groups are prepared for a redrafting of the present bill to include such quotas, others, like the left groups, continue to insist that the bill must be passed first and further quotas can be worked out later. A quandary which women's groups find themselves in with respect to caste quotas within quotas is well exemplified by Manasa. Finding itself unable to decide whether or not to support the women's reservation bill, they contend that raising the demand for reservations for OBC within reservation for women might put the bill into the freezer for another 20 years, while endorsing it as it is without subquotas leaves the problem: how do we plan to lobby for later amendments so that OBC women get adequate representation in politics? Lama Rebel writes that the claim for subquotas for OBC and Muslim women stalled the bill in three respects. From a legal angle, the introduction of a subquota for OBC and Muslim women would require beforehand the implementation of quotas for OBCs and for Muslims as a whole in political assemblies. From a political angle, if OBC and Muslim women were granted a subquota, then other more backward communities would also claim specific provisions for their women. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the very mention of quotas for Muslim women makes the WRB appear as a potential Pandora box of the division of the electorate on communal grounds, which renders it taboo. It might be difficult, as it implies finding a legally and politically defensible strategy to turn the idea into a workable model of representation. Rai writes, quote, "The Indian example critically points to the importance of the recognition of difference between women and women's groups. Because women's groups arguing for quota did not think it strategically necessary to proactively raise the issue of difference among women based on caste, they were wrong-footed politically." Unquote. However, Gail Omvet, an opponent of quotas within quotas, points out, by now the stark antagonism between OBC and feminist leaders is easing. However, what is interesting about the WRB is not only the overt opposition from the advocates of the backward classes, but also the reluctance of the same political parties that had earlier supported reservations for women in local bodies. It may be concluded that the demand for subquota was one of the defining factors behind the stalling of the bill. To summarize, the demand for quota within quota actually meant demands for the sub-reservation for OBC and minority women within the 33% reservation. This became one of the most contentious issues in the passage of, and a major hindrance in the passage of the Women's Reservation Bill. While this issue was being debated amongst the political leaders, and mainly the male political leaders of some of the political parties were vociferous enough to raise out these concerns, there were the opinions of the feminists and the women's movement also were divided on the issue. While the bill was mainly opposed on the count of subquota for women, the opposition was raised by the male political leaders largely, we find that there have been differences of opinion even within the leaders of the women movement and also the feminists. However, largely the feminist standpoint in general has been that they focused on the commonality of women's issues, and therefore no question of subquota for OBC or Muslim women arises for them. Rather, they see it as the ploy to divide the women's movement and dilute the demand for women's reservation bill. In spite of all that we have studied, we can see and safely contend that the demand for subquotas has been successful, or the most successful ploy. We may infer to a degree of certainty that the demand for subquotas has been the major hindrance to the passage of Women's Reservation Bill as of now. Thank you.